Hey, this is guitarist Skye coming at you from beautiful Portland, Oregon, with a bit of a deep dive on recording and mixing an acoustic guitar duo. I'm not claiming to be an expert mixer or anything. I'm just hoping this will be an interesting and hopefully entertaining look into someone else's workflow. I recently finished an all-original flat-picking acoustic guitar album with guitarist Jamie Stillway and yours truly, called Home on the Mid-Range. So Jamie and I had been emailing tune ideas back and forth during the pandemic, and when we got the all clear to come out of our shelters, we met up at my friend Corey Garrick's studio, Sisterly Silence, here in Portland for a few mornings and basically just jammed out this mostly improvised acoustic music. I had done some microphone tests on my own at home with some large diaphragm condensers, ribbon mics. I even had sort of a double mid-side array for a little while, but ended up just keeping things really simple with just a pair of Neumann KM 184s. I think we put up some room mics at one point, and but I later found that I just wanted this sort of just pair of microphones on both of us. I think the 184 is just a nice, big, beautiful sounding microphone. I know it gets a little grief online for being on the bright side compared to the original KM 84, which I have also recorded with. But I feel like, if anything, that brightness is a good thing, especially recording two acoustic guitars. So we sat directly across from each other, very close, like maybe just 2 feet or something, with no baffle. So there's clearly no shortage of mic bleed. But other than the occasional swooshy, phasey moment here and there from maybe one of us moving around a bit or something, I think it worked really well, particularly as far as being able to really hear each other and react to each other in the moment. So for each guitar, we pointed the microphone at the 12th fret, pretty standard stuff, maybe 8 or 9 inches out. Even in a nice studio, I tend to kind of like that more close-in sound. The microphones were parallel to the floor, so not necessarily looking down or looking up at the guitar. And they were angled slightly so they maybe were looking up the fretboard towards maybe the 17th fret of each guitar. And I had actually pre-cut and brought along 2 chopsticks so that between each take, Jamie and I could touch one end to the 12th fret and the other to the end of the microphone, and that would sort of ensure a kind of a more consistent tone for each take and maybe minimize some phase issues or whatnot. So I personally find mixing 2 acoustic guitars to be a little challenging. I mean, it's simple but not easy. Back in 2015, I made an acoustic guitar and mandolin duo album with Tim Connell called June Apple. And in that, we realized like we could both play the same chord at the same time. And because those instruments live in just 2 completely different sonic universes, like there's just seemingly never a problem with buildup of frequencies. But with 2 acoustic guitars, it's kind of like how I imagine it might be mixing 2 pianos. You just sort of always have to be thinking about the differentiation between the players, particularly in that lower mid-range 2 to 300 kind of murky zone. So when it comes to EQ and compression and volume automation, that's kind of always on my mind. So anyway, let's jump into Logic and have a look at a tune. Okay, so I don't think it's too terribly important that I'm using Logic here as my DAW. Whatever DAW or plugins you use is totally fine. There's nothing really unique to Logic or the plugins that I use. So let's just go ahead and listen to a few seconds of one of Jamie's tunes, Hazelnut Grove, as a finished but unmastered mix. So as I said earlier, my friend Corey tracked Jamie and I in his studio, and we left his place with the thumb drive of the stems or tracks as WAV files that I imported into Logic. Let's kind of reset things more or less back to zero, take off the plugins and whatnot, and get the panning all back to center, and we'll kind of build it back up step by step and talk you through it. So I like to start with each track panned back to center. I think that kind of gives us more of a sense of where problem frequency buildup might be, because they're kind of stacked on top of each other. It also kind of helps to hear level issues, I think. Corey did a great job of getting the levels right on the mic pre's on the way in. And then with Jamie and I sitting close and hopefully listening and paying attention to each other, that all gets us about 90% of the way there, I think, with the levels. And then I like to do a fair amount of volume automation right from the outset, just to kind of fine tune the levels a little bit. So if I hit A on my keyboard in Logic, that takes me right to automation. And, as I listen to this, I might decide that maybe one of us overall needs to be louder. So, everything's back to center, the plugins are off, it's not so exciting, but again, it's a good way to kind of listen to it objectively. And I'm just going to add a dB to Jamie kind of overall. And that's a good start. So I just pushed that guy up. I might decide that maybe Jamie, this whole A part, I'm assuming this is all one A part, she needs to come up a little bit more. So I'm going to use my marquee tool, my favorite tool in Logic. So holding down the command key and just kind of dragging along here and just moving that one section up another dB. So let's just pretend that's right. Okay, and then from there, it's going to get, even smaller. So then maybe as I listen through, I might decide maybe that one note that Jamie played was just the coolest thing. So I'll just grab that one note and just give that maybe another half a dB. Very subtle. And of course, we're going to add compression later, so it's getting real OCD. I might bump it up a little bit more. Maybe I'll just pretend this is an issue. Let's see. Maybe this note that I'm playing is kind of, maybe it's a little big sounding or obscuring something Jamie's doing. So I might go in and grab that note and pull that guy down a little bit. So I'll go through the whole tune with it panned in center and just do all this little tweaky stuff. And it may end up looking pretty crazy, but that's kind of my initial levels. When it comes to EQ and acoustic music, a goal for me for sure is the whole less is more thing. Maybe even none is the right choice. Definitely better to focus on getting the mic position when you track it. It's better to get that good capture up front and not bake problems into the cake. It's just way easier. It's kind of like photography, when getting a great image is about taking that extra time to think through how the light is moving around in the room, where you get the best natural balance. So I have an EQ plugin on each individual track. So I have a high-pass filter at 40, which is eliminating any rumble in the room or burritos being digested. So we have a little dip happening here at about 200 on both of us. Mine's going a little deeper than Jamie's because I think my guitar has just a little bit more of that. But again, this is a place where I think acoustic guitars often need to be paid attention to, and particularly with two of them, because it's going to be double the trouble, right? I'm using FabFilter's dynamic EQ feature, which uses compression so that the reduction's only happening when the volume of that frequency reaches a certain threshold. So otherwise it's leaving it alone, because it is, it is an important area too in terms of like the bigness of the sound. We just don't want it to pop out too much. So if I hit play, we can kind of see what's happening a little bit. So you can see on FabFilter's spectrum analyzer there that, I'm definitely hitting that zone hard. And you could see there that Jamie wasn't necessarily in that passage. So anyway, and then in Jamie's, I brought down, I guess around 550, just, in this particular tune. Just felt like that was a frequency that I wanted to kind of pull out just a tiny bit. I should say also that even though the whole album is just, us and just the same guitars, each tune is in a different key. And so certain frequencies are going to be sort of emphasized more than others. So these settings change a little bit from tune to tune. So if I solo out Jamie's guitar and we hit this little headphone icon here, that'll allow us to just listen to that frequency that's being taken out. Hopefully you can hear this. Let's see. So obviously super subtle. I'll try to crank that up in post so you can hear that, but just a little bit of a mid-range peak. Other than that, our EQ is just flat, so nothing else really happening. So I'm not going to lie, I love compression. People can be pretty conservative about it in the instrumental acoustic guitar world, I guess, and I am too, but I really like what it does, and I do think it's a big part of what makes a record sound like a record. I think of compression mostly as an automatic volume control, but it also slightly changes the way notes behave. When things get above a certain point, it gently, or sometimes not so gently, turns them down a bit, effectively bringing the quieter stuff up. So imagine if you were watching a band in a club with a singer who was kind of randomly moving back and forth from the mic stand. At times they would be sort of too far and would sound weaker, and then, a moment later it might be sort of too close. You would just perceive the vocals as sort of coming and going in the mix. But compression would even that out and sort of hold that singer in place a little bit. So there are 3 different stages of compression in this mix. The first one is I have an individual instance on our tracks. So I've got one for me, I've got one for Jamie. Let's listen to a little bit of this, and you can kind of watch the metering up here to see what kind of reduction's happening. Okay, so you can see it, I guess I dropped the needle, so to speak, in a kind of a quieter part of the tune. So you can see very little happening. Maybe we can go to a busier section. Okay, let's keep an eye on Jamie down here. Or I guess that's me. Anyway, so you can see in various places, I'm just getting like a dB or 2 sometimes of gain reduction. And I'm also using my mix control down here, so it's a little bit of a parallel compression. So even if that looks like a lot, which it's not, I'm mixing some of that dry signal back in. Next up, I made a parallel compression track over here. This is going to seem a little nutty. So sometimes known, I believe, as, let's see if I can get this to open, New York style compression, mostly thought of, for making drums sound bigger, I think. So this is going to seem really radical, but it's important to note at the outset that I'm using very little of it. But the idea is to really over compress and just kind of bring up the stuff from the bottom, because the previous form of compression was kind of taking those peaks off the top. But what this is doing is it's kind of bringing the quieter parts up. So I really like this, like, I don't know if you do like a string bend or something and you really hear that kind of rubbing up of the wood or something. I kind of like all that stuff to happen. So this is maybe bringing some of that a little bit forward. So I have an EQ just before it on this track only that's doing a pretty big bass roll off starting at about 300. Now that's because the bass energy, is going to have the most effect on the compressor. So I don't want to bog down the compressor with all that bass. What I'm really trying to do is bring up some of the goodies from the mid-range. And again, I'm going to play a little bit of this, and it's probably going to look, it really looks like an alarming amount of compression. Let's just hit play. It looks crazy. I don't even, what is that, like a 15 dB reduction? But again, we're only using a very tiny amount of it. So let's actually mute this track, and we'll hear it without. And then let's hear it back in. Very, very subtle. So that's another type of compression that's happening here. Seems like a big deal, but again, I'm just bringing up just a very subtle taste of it. So the last stage of compression I have here, and this is sort of pretending the limiter's not on there, is this instance of Pro C2 again on the mix bus. This time I've got it set to the opto setting, which I believe is sort of modeling like an LA2A. It's like a little slower, more kind of musical, gluey kind of compression, I think. I've got the threshold. I got the ratio at 2:1. I got a threshold that hopefully is giving me around 2 dB. I also want to point out that there again, this is sort of like a parallel compression because this plugin, like a lot of plugins, I think has a wet dry mix knob. So I'm kind of bringing some of that dry signal back up. So I think it's going to look like a subtle amount of compression, but it's even more subtle than it looks. Let's give this a listen. So it looks like I'm getting about 2, sometimes almost even 3 dBs of gain reduction, but it's got some of the dry signal mixed in, so it's a little less than it looks. So moving on to reverb, I've got the panning set a little wide now. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about panning, but for now I'm just kind of putting them out there for demo purposes. Reverb is a stereo effect, at least I have it set up as a stereo effect, so I think that's going to allow us to kind of hear what it's doing a little bit more. I have the reverb set up on its own track, an auxiliary track, so this is another form of parallel processing like we did with the compression, with parallel compression. We have sort of a parallel reverb, so it's kind of allowing us to use the fader to kind of bring it up from below. There's a couple reasons. I mean, a lot of people just like to work this way. That's kind of how I like to apply it. It gives me some control that I'll talk about in a minute with EQ and stuff. But you could just put it on the stereo bus too. I think if you have like a big band production and you want everybody to sort of sound like they're in the same space and cut down on processing power and whatnot, then putting it on an auxiliary track is pretty common practice. Reverb in general, I want to sort of, I guess it's a cliche, but I sort of want to feel it a little bit more than I hear it. A good steel string acoustic guitar really has a lot of sort of natural reverb, a lot of sort of overtones and sympathetic ringing. So, I'm just very careful not to do too much here. I've got an instance of Fab Filter again. I have other reverb programs. I think I'm just showing you what I did, earlier this year. I think lately I've been using this Liquid Sonics Seventh Heaven reverb plugin, and then I have some other reverbs of like. But anyway, so just kind of a Fab Filter kind of day here. So you can see I've got 1.6 seconds of decay time. I've got about 41 milliseconds of pre-delay. I think that's really important. That's really when the reverb kicks in. That's very subtle, but having like a little bit of pre-delay kind of allows the ear to hear, the present sound, and then the reverb happens a little later, so you're kind of out in front of it a little bit more. So playing around with pre-delay is something that I kind of enjoy messing around with. Everything else is kind of pretty standard stuff. let's have a quick listen. So if I stop it, like I'll just try to hit a percussive note and just stop it, and you can kind of hear the tail a little bit, right? It kind of sounds dramatic that way, but that doesn't really happen in the music. So it's just giving a taste of the tail. So one of the things that I'm doing, at least I think I did, I can't remember if this was selected or not now, but I'm using this sort of, I know I did. I'm using this, I think, so-called Abbey Road trick of putting an EQ before the reverb plugin. A lot of reverb plugins have pre-EQs. I just kind of like to do it on a separate plugin, and it's one of the advantages of having an auxiliary track is you can do some further processing. But what's happening here is I'm rolling off everything below 300 because, again, that bass has more energy, so I'm not really wanting to reverberate that. Like, I'm not wanting to, for the low, mid, mud stuff to ring longer. And then also so that's preventing it from entering the reverb plugin because it's coming first, right? So, and I'm doing the same thing above, it looks like 6,300. I don't know, it could be a little more, a little less. Again, like I don't want that super shimmery stuff necessarily entering either. I'll give you some before and afters, but I think if you get too much high end in the reverb, it gets kind of that colder sort of 80s digital reverb sound that I'm kind of trying to avoid. Let's listen to the reverb again. Actually, let's solo the reverb. This is going to sound really weird, and I'm going to bring it up so you can hear it a little bit. And this is just the reverb track, so it's going to be kind of drowning in reverb. But that's a great way to kind of really, I'm going to turn up a little bit more, a great way to really hear what's all happening here. So I'll take this EQ in and out. So this is without it. And then I'll put it back in. Now I get that the first one sounded fuller or whatever, but again, I'm trying not to exaggerate all that fullness. I just want to hear more of that kind of room sound, I guess, and less of the bass and high stuff. So I'm filtering that out. Okay. So now as I bring back everybody else, and that's kind of a lot because I had the fader up, right? So I'm going to take it out, and you'll hear it. This is totally dry. And notice again, like there's a lot of sympathetic ringing and overtones and stuff. So other than when I stopped it cold, I think it actually has a little natural reverb happening just in the instruments. But I'm going to bring up the reverb now. I'm going to exaggerate it and then pull it back. Of course, I don't remember exactly where it was, but you get the idea. So that's how I think about reverb. I really spend a lot of time kind of playing around and thinking about it and stuff. And it's kind of an important decision, and it can feel like a pretty nebulous thing to work on. So I kind of go back and forth, and you definitely want to listen in different environments, etc. Circling back to panning for a bit here, it's actually one of my favorite things to tweak. And I think for this project, I really spent a lot of time on it. Just a little indecision, but also each project is going to have its own considerations. I have it set now where I basically arrived for the overall setting, which is me at, if this was a clock, I'm at approximately 9:30 and Jamie's at 10:30. And that may or may not look wide to you. It seems wide to me, but it's really important to remember, going back to the beginning when I showed a picture of Jamie and I in the studio, that we're sitting directly across from each other with no baffle. We're very close, and there's just a lot of mic bleed, and that's okay. That just means that there's a lot of center image just baked into the cake already. So it's not as wide as it looks. Anyway, I also did some automation with the panning. So if I hit the letter A on my keyboard again, we're looking behind the scenes at the automation, and you could see in the beginning, I've got Jamie at 31, and then presumably this next chorus is like me maybe taking a solo or something. Now I'm at 31 and Jamie's at 33. So sometimes I'll play with larger pieces of real estate, and instead of maybe turning one of us up or down, I'm just kind of moving a little more slightly to center. This is super subtle, but it's a kind of thing that I like to tweak with. So at this point, I'm basically done with the mix, especially considering it's then going to go off to a mastering engineer to finish. I have the Pro L2, which is FabFilter's limiter. I'm just kind of using it as just kind of a faux mastering. But let's pretend that I'm not sending this off to mastering, and that maybe it's just like a YouTube video or something, and I'm just going to post it to social media. So I do need to get it up to volume. First of all, I'm very happy with where the EQ is, and I'd be happy if that's what gets printed. But I like to leave that last EQ decision up to the mastering engineer, someone who's going to hear it with fresh ears or whatever. So again, if I wasn't doing that, then I would probably open up another instance of EQ. I'd probably put it, I don't know, probably after the compressor. And, earlier stages of EQ were really about correcting things, like eliminating some of that buildup at 200. Maybe there was one little notch I did on Jamie's guitar. I think we did the bass roll off and everything. But now it's about maybe the sweetening, right? So I might, we can just pretend to do some of this stuff, but I might make some gradual bells and shelves and whatnot. So let's grab 5K and just kick it up a little bit and see what happens. One tip is, just try really exaggerating. That obviously sounds spiky and crispy or whatever, but at least now you know what it's doing, right? And so, you could just isolate it here. And you can play around to hear different spots that sound pleasant that you might want to bring out. I actually kind of like this 5K thing, but it was really spiky where it was, so we're going to kind of bring it down. And so, again, I don't think I need this at all, but just for grins. And FabFilter, you can go down here and you could make this so it only happens on the sides, and that would kind of maybe give it a subtle widening effect. Let's see what happens if I'll exaggerate it. So again, that's just making that boost only happen on the far left and far right. You could change it to the center, so it's only happening in the middle. You get the idea. But this really is kind of a segue into another thing I wanted to talk about briefly, is I might put on a saturation plugin. I'm not going to demo that right now because I'm kind of leaning towards not doing it. But I have Soft Tube's tape plugin. I also have a new one that I've been playing around with by Cush Audio called The Bliss, which is a great little saturator, but I might mess around with that a little bit. But I'm definitely going to use the limiter to get things up to volume. So maybe we can just talk for a second about volume. FabFilter's limiter has a volume meter on it, but in case you don't have this one, you can totally use the Logic adaptive limiter. Is fantastic. I can't remember if that has a meter on it or not. So if we go under metering and bring up loudness meter and put that at the end here, we can use this to kind of see where we're at. So if we hit start, give it a listen. So it's giving us a couple different readouts here. Let's put this up around, I don't know, maybe let's say 13, 14, let's say a lucky 13. That's about where I want the LUFS. What the LUFS? The LUFS is the kind of measurement of the volume here, and something like 12, 13, 14 is probably a good place to send to YouTube. I think that they actually want it to be at 14, but we'll push our luck a little bit here. And what we want to do is every time we make a change, we want to hit reset. And I'm mostly looking at integrated. So the momentary is just what's happening sort of note by note. I think short term it's either 6 or 10 second spans, but integrated is what's happening across the whole tune or the whole period of time that you're listening to. So I'll usually listen to probably a couple minutes of it, so it kind of hears some loud parts and some quiet parts. But let's go ahead and look at this and see where we're at. So we're about minus 19, and I think that can come up a little bit. So I'll kick on the limiter, and let's see what happens if I add about 4.5 dBs from the limiter gain. Yeah, I'm going to add another one or so. Let's go up to 6, kind of push things. Yeah, and I feel like we're right there. I think that's a good volume for like a social media post or whatever. So at this point, I'll take off the little faux mastering moves we did there in the last few minutes and say that the mix is basically done. So I would bounce it down to a WAV file and email it to my good friend John Neufeld at Treehouse Mastering here in Portland, who mastered the whole album. And by taking off that sort of faux mastering and the limiter in particular, you know, I think it was at minus 20 or minus 21. So he's got plenty of room to work with. The way I think of mastering, and again, I'm clearly no expert, you know, you're so deep in it that you're paying somebody that you trust, you know, to take it into a new room and with new monitors and hear it for the first time and be able to tell you you're done, right? So that's really important. And that's why I left that final stage of EQ off, because I thought it was great the way it was. But if it needed any little thing, then I'm trusting that John will, you know, take it there. And lastly, I'll say that I have a history of, you know, working with mastering engineers who are working in the analog domain, sometimes mastering to tape, or I know in John's case, he's got a whole bunch of just beautiful old analog gear. You know, I'm very happy in the digital world of recording, but it doesn't hurt to have a little of that analog fur on there at the end. All right, so that's all I know. Just in the off chance that anybody made it all the way to the end, I thank you. And feel free to go in the comment section below and ask any questions you might have, or just say hi. I guess in particular, I'm curious if anybody would like me to make some more tutorial content on acoustic guitars and audio video stuff. But otherwise, thanks for checking it out, and bye for now.